Good morning. A lot of you are awake this morning. And a lot of you probably woke up when a guy named Mike got up here to read the scripture reading, and he is no longer Mustache Mike. Thank you for reading that verse this morning, Mike. It's a really, really powerful verse. In this song, the Hebrews have just gotten delivered from Egypt, and they get to the other side of the Red Sea, and Moses asks this question. It's a rhetorical question. Who is like you, Lord, in all the earth? And the answer is very, very, very clear. No one. There is absolutely no one quite like you, God. We're going to talk this morning about subverting expectations. It's been, close to a month now since we talked about this last time. So I wanted to do a little bit of review. But if you remember last time, we talked a little bit about what it means to subvert expectations. Usually, when someone expects something is coming, to subvert that would mean to give them something else. Here's a really silly example, not from last time. I thought of a new one. Have you ever thought someone had a water, but they actually had Sprite? And suddenly that delicious, refreshing drink of Sprite burns and is assaulting to your mouth. I had an expectation that this was going to be refreshing water, and instead I got, what someone who didn't know what Sprite was might think is poison, right? It just is, it bites and it bubbles and it's in my nose somehow. It doesn't meet the expectation. It subverts what you're expecting. We talked about last time how Jesus does this all the time. We referenced a song, The Hero of Israel, and we looked at examples where Jesus subverted expectations. When he was 12 years old, Jesus, as a 12-year-old, should have probably been with his parents like most 12-year-olds, and instead he stayed behind in Jerusalem to talk with the elders in the temple, and they were amazed because he was asking questions like the teachers ask, not learning like a 12-year-old should. Then Jesus subverted the expectation of the rich young ruler. This young, wealthy ruler comes up to Jesus and says, "Hey, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, I know the answer you want. Keep the commandments." And he says, "Well, I've done that." And he says, "Well, then here's the answer you weren't expecting. Go give everything you have away." Right? He subverted the expectations with the rich young ruler. It's not only about keeping the rules. Thirdly, we talked about how he subverted expectations with the woman at the well. There's this interaction between Jesus and a Samaritan woman who is not at the well at the right time of day. And everything about this interaction says Jesus probably shouldn't be dealing with her socially. But again, he speaks to her. And we can tell that he's subverted some expectation because she says, "Are you talking to me? A Samaritan? Are you serious? You're talking to me?" Well, okay, if you're talking to me, then let's talk. All right, it's a countercultural example of Jesus interacting with someone who the culture would say he shouldn't be dealing with. And then lastly, we looked at the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 and how everything that Jesus says about following God is backwards to what you would expect following God to look like. And we finished up pointing to the ultimate example of God subverting expectations with Jesus on the cross. He says the true way to eternal life is through death. If that doesn't subvert expectation, I don't know what does. I mean, truthfully, that's the climax of the story of the Bible, is that if you want to be saved, you have to die. And Jesus said, "I'll die for you, but you still have to die to yourself and live in me." And so this is subverting expectations. And Jesus did it clearly. And when you look at the Bible and you zoom out, we could have probably done an entire other lesson on God subverting expectations and looking at Old Testament examples of this. You might ask, why did God let his people get enslaved in Egypt? Well, he did deliver them, but why did it take 10 plagues? Why couldn't he have just made it happen after one? Right? You might ask, why did God decide to speak to people through prophets instead of directly? The expectation of what God should do in the Old Testament often doesn't match up. One really, really clear example of this is the story of Naaman the leper in 2 Kings chapter 5. If you go read this story, I'm going to give you the Joseph version with the Cliff Notes. Go read it on your own time. Basically, Naaman's a leper, and so he calls this prophet to him, and the prophet says, if you want to be cleansed from your leprosy, if you want to be healed, God said, go dunk yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. And Naaman is disappointed. He's like, I thought he was going to tell me to do something awesome, right? It's like the little kid in The Incredibles. What are you waiting for? I don't know. Something amazing, I guess, right? Like he was expecting something better than just go dunk yourself in the gross Jordan River. The notoriously gross Jordan River. I mean, we might say it's kind of like someone said, hey, go dunk yourself in Lake Louisville. It's known to be gross, right? You know what I mean? You can't see past this far. So Naaman is told these instructions. If you want to be healed, you want to be cleaned, go dunk yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. That's what God said. And Naaman doesn't want to do it. He's disappointed because he wanted to do something. He expected something great. And then one of his servants says, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you have done it? He says, well, sure. Well, then why won't you do it when the prophet said to do something simple, right? And Naaman's like, well, it's too reasonable. So he goes and he dunks himself in the Jordan 7 times. And guess what happens? He's healed. See, Naaman had an expectation of what God healing him should look like. And what he got subverted those expectations. It was something very normal and very simple and not clean to make him clean. Very common thing that God did in the Old Testament to subvert expectations. Like we talked about the last time, Jesus subverted the expectations with the woman at the well. And he also did this with his teaching. I mean, when you read through the accounts of Jesus interacting with the Pharisees or the scribes and the teachers, they come up and they try and trap him. The two that always come to my mind first are Mark 12 and Mark chapter 2/3. They kind of bleed into each other there. But in Mark 2 and 3, the teachers are upset with him about the Sabbath. Why aren't you keeping the Sabbath the way you're supposed to keep the Sabbath? And Jesus' answer is not, well, I am kind of in a way. Like he doesn't justify it and he doesn't fight with them. Instead, he just goes completely off the beaten path and says, have you even read the Bible? Right? Your understanding of Sabbath is so far removed from what God was doing with the Sabbath that it's like you haven't even read it. Right? They did not expect that answer. When in Mark chapter 12, they come to Jesus, 2 opposing forces, the Herodians and the Pharisees, who both, that is as contrasted as the extreme Democrat and the extreme Republican joining forces to trap somebody in their words. That's what's going on here. And so they come to Jesus and they say, should we pay taxes or should we not? Now the Herodians would have said, of course, because Herod, we like Herod. And the Pharisees would have said, of course not, because we don't like Herod. We only have one king and it's God. And so Jesus ends up giving him an answer that no one expected. It was like they said, door A or door B. And Jesus said, door Jesus, right? He subverted expectation even with his answer. He didn't pick door C, right? He picked door Jesus, and he answers, and he says, give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and to God the things that belong to God. And they left the people marveling at his teaching. They were blown away. All right, so you've got a very clear example of God in the Old Testament, Jesus in the New Testament, and really the entire story of the Bible. Subversion of expectation is a thing, all right? If God did it and Jesus did it, should we do it? There's a real question. If we see Jesus regularly subverting people's expectation, and we see that God throughout history has not done things the way people think they ought to be done, he subverts expectation then, is that something that Christians should do as well? I think so. I think if we're people who say, I am a Jesus follower, that means we look like Jesus. And if he subverted expectations, that should be something we think about as well. So what does that mean? What does that look like? To be like Christ, we need to subvert expectations. Well, for one, you're going to have to know what the expectations are. And so the question I want to start with, 9 minutes in, the question I want to get into this morning is what are the expectations of Christians by the world? What does the world expect to get when they interact with a Christian or when they interact with the church? What do people who don't know church expect from the church? Well, if we understand that, then we need to do the opposite, right? You think about this, and it's not just the opposite, right? If someone says, well, Christians, for example, Christians don't ever drink. And then we say, well, the opposite of that is to get drunk. Like, that's not what I'm saying, okay? Don't take this the godly opposite. You understand? If we know how the world perceives the church, if we know how people generally think about Christians or our culture perceives Christians, then we need to do the godly opposite of what they expect in order to subvert the expectation and show them, and this is really the point, show them who God really is. And so we're going to look at 3 of them, although there are a ton of them. A ton of ideas about Christians that we could look at. I picked 3, I tried to pick 3 big ones. Ideas that people have or our culture has about the Christians that we need to attempt to subvert. So the first one is, I think this might be the very first thing you'll get from anyone who doesn't know the church or like the church is, they'll say, well, the church is just full of hypocrites. Listen, I have heard this so many times. So many times. They'll say something like, well, they act like they don't sin, right? Or they act like they're high. It's just a bunch of hypocrites. They do one thing on Sundays, and then they do another thing all the rest of the week. They're just a bunch of hypocrites. I mean, like, if we're being honest, they're kind of right sometimes. Like, there's probably a reason why they feel that way, and there are probably things that even I have done that have lent someone to that way of thinking. Like, I'm just trying to be honest about this. And so you can't just say, well, that's just a jaded, unfair thing to say. Well, there's probably some truth in the perception. And so we have to be fair about that. However, we need to attempt to subvert that expectation. Because when someone says Christians are hypocrites, we ought to have the response, oh, you don't know Jesus. Right? You don't know the Jesus I follow. Think about this. Well, there's a really great example. I wish Joy was here this morning. But for those of you that know Joy Milton, do you remember meeting her? When you meet Joy, it's an experience, all right? She is so friendly, but she's also real witty, and she's also like a lot of fun, but also a little bit mean, but like in the playful way. You know what I'm saying, all right? All right? So listen. When you meet Joy and you try and do normal things like shake her hand, she says, "Oh, you don't know me," and she'll give you a hug, right? Or you try and say, "Hi, how are you doing?" She'll come at you with, "Well, I'm better than I was yesterday," and she'll give you an answer that kind of catches you a little off guard, kind of like the crazy aunt at Christmas who the in-law meets for the first time and just tries to say hi, and shake the hand, and then they get the yank in and the hug. You know what I'm talking about. So there's this, we have a space for this in our regular world where, oh, you know how things, you have an expectation, but you don't know me, right? You must not know me very well. If you expect short sermons, what am I going to tell you? You see what I'm saying, right? You get my point here. So sometimes people have an expectation of Christians, and they'll say, well, the church is just full of a bunch of hypocrites. And you say, well, you don't know Jesus if you think that. You have a point. There's truth in what you're saying, but you don't know my Jesus. And so as Christians, we need to live in a way that subverts that expectation. And if we're going to subvert the expectation that Christians are hypocrites, what is the opposite of a hypocrite? Right? What is the godly opposite of a hypocrite? So here's the way my brain went as I was thinking about this. My first thought was, well, how do we normally answer that question? Because it's a fairly common question. We say, sure, you're totally right. There are hypocrites everywhere. And we kind of do the thing where, well, everyone's doing it, so it's not all that bad. I don't think that's a great approach. There's truth in it, but I don't think that's a great way of showing people who Jesus is. Then my next thought was, well, the opposite of a hypocrite is so if someone acts like they don't sin and then they do sin, or someone acts one way but says one thing but does a different. Okay, so then the opposite of that would be moral excellence, right? So if all of us say we don't sin and then actually don't sin, we're not hypocrites anymore. And we could preach that. And I think there's a valuable lesson to be preached in saying, don't be a hypocrite. I think that's great. But what is the actual godly opposite of a hypocrite? Honesty. right? A hypocrite at its core is a liar, someone who says one thing but lives differently. The word comes from a Greek word that was a word used to talk about theater actors. They were hypocrites because they would pretend on stage with a mask to be someone they were not. And so that's the idea behind our word hypocrite, is that you are being someone, you're proclaiming to be someone that you are not actually living like. And so what is the opposite of that? Well, we proclaim to be someone that we are. We're honest. You think about this. The opposite of being a hypocrite is being willing to admit our faults. Do we have Bible precedent for that? Well, you bet. You think about the way David writes his Psalms. You think about the way David writes his, and we're not going to dive into too many of them or look at them too closely this morning, but I encourage you to go read some of the Psalms that David writes. I mean, you get a picture of a king who wrestles with doubt, who wrestles with the idea that God is good, right? He wrestles with the idea of wanting good things for other people. You get this picture of David who recognizes his imperfection and his sin and says it plainly to God, right? You don't get an idea that David is pretending when he's talking to God and then real in his life as a king. You see a person who is the same in front of God and in his day-to-day life. You think about Paul. As Paul writes in his letter to Timothy, he says, "The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the biggest." That's how I put it, right? Of whom I am the chief. Paul says, listen, Jesus didn't come to save people and make them perfect. Like I'm not perfect now. I'm still the chief of sinners. I'm only perfect because Jesus saved me. And his sin is right there in front of him. Paul goes from saying, I am the least of the apostles, to I am the worst of sinners. He doesn't claim to be one thing and live differently. He knows exactly who he is. He is an incredibly valuable and incredibly worthless human whose value is given and held by God, whose actions are not a reflection of who God is, but a reflection of how badly he needs God. See, this is Paul. He's not a hypocrite. He's honest. The godly opposite of a hypocrite is being honest, and we can do this by confession. We can do this by, I don't know how to put this in more plain English, by being honest. Just being honest with people about our struggles. Now, don't take this too far. This doesn't mean you just say, hey, it's fine, everyone is. You don't say everyone's a hypocrite, so it's fine. That's not the point. The point is, listen, I'm not a hypocrite. I'm imperfect, and I fail, and I struggle, and I fight with stuff, and I wrestle with doubt, and I wrestle with sin. That's me, Joseph. I'm talking about me. I do that probably every day, if not multiple times a day. That's what I do. I'm only a Christian because of Christ. I'm not pretending. I don't live in some delusion as if I am perfect, or I am a Christian, or I am saved because of me. That is the godly opposite of being a hypocrite. Think about the man in Mark chapter 9 when he's asking for Jesus to heal his demon-possessed, does it have a D on the end of it? It doesn't, right? That's one of those words you say so often you forget how it's spelled, right? This man has a demon-possessed son, and he comes to Jesus and he says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And in verse 23, Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Almost like, don't you believe what you're saying, you hypocrite? You hear that? And yet the man responds immediately. The father of the child cried out and said, I believe. Help my unbelief. He said, I'm not a hypocrite. I believe and I don't believe. I'm wrestling with it. This is the godly opposite. This is how we subvert the expectation that Christians are all hypocrites. You can't be a hypocrite if you're honest. And so we need to be honest. Secondly, if you ask what do people generally think about Christians, one of the things, and this is like a big umbrella one, but one of the things people will say is that they are judgmental. Christians are super judgmental. There aren't more judgmental people in the world than Christians. Although if you're my age, you don't say judgmental, you say judgy, right? Like there's this idea that they're better than everyone, right? That they have their little struggles, but everyone else is a dirty, dirty sinner, right? Christians might be depicted as being against everything, right? It doesn't matter what I'm for. Christians are against it. They're always adversarial and judgmental. And again, we got to be honest. They're kind of right. Like, I've experienced Christians who were judgmental. I mean, I woke up and looked in the mirror this morning. Like, I've had dealings where I wasn't the judgmental one and felt judged by something. I mean, listen, sometimes, yeah, Christians are struggling with being judgmental. That's true. But you don't know my Jesus. Because my Jesus, he's not like that, right? He's not judgmental, okay? So if we're going to subvert the expectation that Christians are judgmental people, then what do we do? What is the godly opposite of judgmental? And I went through 10 different words or ideas. The idea I want to communicate is loving, okay? But I'm going to be honest, if I just said Christians are loving, I feel like that goes in one ear and out the other. Because what does that even mean? And here's the word I settled on. I think we can subvert the expectation that Christians are judgmental by being compassionate. I think if we are compassionate people who recognize difficulty in others and don't judge but feel empathy for, then that's going to change or subvert the expectation that is placed upon Christians. You think about all the different places where empathy is implied. Jesus, we just read one, or talked about one in Mark chapter 9. The man says, if you have any compassion on us. And what did Jesus do? Well, he had compassion on him. He healed his son. Matthew chapter, I meant Mark chapter 9, but Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is doing his teaching. And in verse 36, it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless. They were like sheep without a shepherd. Listen, we could look at the world and say, you idiots, don't you read the Bible? Well, that's not very compassionate, right? That might be something they need to hear eventually, but that's not, I don't know if that's going to get them excited about hearing the rest of what you have to say. Rather, Jesus looks at the crowd and he says, look at all these people who are just lost. They're wandering around. They don't have anyone to lead them or show them where to go. And he has compassion on them. Now, here's the other part of this. He was talking about us. We're the lost sheep without a shepherd. You think about what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. He's talking to Christians here. He just got done saying Jews aren't better than Gentiles and Gentiles aren't better than Jews. You're all saved the same way. And he wraps up with this statement about, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. I want to know for a second, if you saw someone who was separated from Christ, alienated from the nation of Israel, a stranger to the covenants of promise, and had no hope and did not have God in the world, what is the appropriate response to that kind of person? It should be compassion, right? It should not be, well, don't you see Israel is right here? I mean, haven't you heard about the covenants? Don't you know that God is everywhere? Can't you look around and see him, right? Let me show you a Bible verse that says you should be able to do that. And if you can't, then you're wrong. Like, if someone is lost and has no hope and has no connection to God, those things may be true. But they're not going to hear him well. What they're going to hear is, man, I remember that. I was there, and it's not fun. Let me show you something that really, really helped me. You think about the way Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 6, when he lists this big, long list of sins that, we like to pick a couple out. But, it's a big, long, pretty all-encompassing list. Pretty much everyone's going to get hit by that scattershot of sins that Paul lists. And at the very end, what does he say? And such were some of you, right? You were those people. The people you're having a problem with, that was you not too long ago. You see, if we look at people who do not know God and are lost and don't know anything about Jesus, and we just say, come on, right? Come on. You have the Bible. There's more Bibles in the world today than ever before. You have no excuse. Listen, that might be true. That is true. Both of those statements are true. God says you're without excuse, right? And there are factually more Bibles in the world today than ever before. How many people do you think are going to listen to that? Think about John chapter 8, right? John chapter 8, these Pharisees catch this woman in the act of adultery. No idea what it looked like. No idea. And what we know for sure is they knew for sure that she had committed adultery. She slept with someone that wasn't her husband, right? They drag her out of that situation, bring her before Jesus, and say, hey, we know what the law says. Have you read the Bible? We've read it. It says stone her. Stone her to death. What does Jesus do? Does he start with, yeah, that's right. We got to punish that sin for sure. But have you thought about it? Look at the order in which Jesus reacts to this situation. What does he start with? Compassion. Anyone who wasn't her before, anyone who has never been in her spot, guilty of violating the law, you throw the first stone, right? Then he kneels down when they all leave. He kneels down and he says, hey, where are all those people that were going to condemn you? He doesn't say, now they left. Now listen, let me tell you, you can't do the adultery stuff. You got to quit that. Like, that's not where he starts. It's not where he starts with the people. It's not where he starts with the woman. He leans down. He says, listen, where'd they go? I guess we're all pretty imperfect. Now your job is to quit doing that. Go and sin no more. He doesn't condone the sin. He doesn't embrace and accept whatever that person is. You're an adulterer? You just keep adulterating. No worries. He doesn't do that. But you know where he does not start? He doesn't start with adultery, right? I mean, let's say somebody is a rampant thief. They don't know Jesus. They don't know there's any reason not to be. They've been embezzling for years. It's done well for them. And it really hasn't hurt the company too bad. And so they've been embezzling for years. And as they're learning, wanting to know more about this church thing, they walk into the church building and they see me there and they say, hey, I wanted to know more about this church thing. And I say, oh, well, let me ask you, are you a thief? Because you're going to have to stop that right now if you want to hear any more about Jesus. Well, I am a thief, and it does well for me, and if that's the case, I'm out, all right? You see, that's the expectation, is that a Christian is going to be judgmental, that they're going to attack the things you do wrong and come at you for those things. And there is a place and a time for those things. But boy, am I not going to start there. You know why? Because that's right where people expect you to start. Someone knows the problem they have in their life. They know roughly what you are going to say about it. Go somewhere else. I mean, this woman was likely naked and in front of Jesus, having been caught in the very act of adultery. Where do you think she thought he was going to start? He's probably going to tell me to put some clothes on and quit adulterating, right? I think I've made that word up. Is that a word? All right, listen, that's probably where he's going to start. And Jesus didn't even say the word. Now, the message came through. If we are going to be people who subvert the expectation of the world, we cannot be judgmental right off the bat. We've got to be compassionate first so that we can subvert the expectation and teach people who Jesus really is. Last, and we'll go through this one fairly quickly. A very common thing you will get to Christians, or a perception of the world of Christians, and especially preachers, is that it is all about money and fame. All right? And, you probably thought of a couple preachers who it is all about money and fame right off the bat, right? Like, they're not thinking that for no reason, They're kind of right. Sometimes it is. I've often wondered if we should separate the Lord's Supper from the offering, because it kind of feels like, well, Jesus forgave you, now pay up, doesn't it? I mean, listen, we know that's not what we mean. That's in no way. We're just passing plates. We have guys up here, and it's a good time to pass the other plate because we've already got guys up here. But I can see how somebody could take that the wrong way. If the world thinks that Christians are all about getting money, getting support or donations, and that Christians are all about fame to spread their message and get more notoriety, then we've got to be able to subvert that expectation with the godly opposite. I don't know that you would say the opposite of money and fame is people, but that's what we're going with for this morning, all right? The church is not all about money, and the church is not all about fame. The church is all about people. We don't care about money. We don't care about notoriety. We don't care about brand recognition and advertisement. We care that people hear what God has for them to hear. We care that people know who Jesus is and that they come and experience the saving grace that God is offering to every human. That's what we care about. Think about this. The world will often see examples of what we've come to call mega churches in America. That's what we call them here. We just call them a mega church. And mega churches have a couple of characteristics. The first thing is they all have a podcast. All right, I'm kidding. That's not true. But mega churches will usually have a very prominent preacher figure, and it'll be good looking, clean cut, probably wear some kind of either trendy clothes or a suit, a very confident and comfortable, easy to listen to speaker. Generally, he doesn't really say things that are off subject. He gives a very culturally appropriate message. As a result, the church grows, and that's what we're really after. Even if you say you're after making a difference in the world, well, the world sees that as meaning you want more people, right? You want to grow everything and get more people in. Okay, that's fine. I see it. I see that the world does that. What did Jesus do? What did Jesus do when he was here on the earth? As he was teaching, did he start a podcast? Right? No, he didn't. Did he plant a mega church and gain a huge following? Well, actually, he did two things that I think fly directly in the face, dare I say, subvert that expectation. The first thing is this. Jesus was very concerned with going one at a time. There would be a whole crowd of people, like in the story of Zacchaeus. There's this whole crowd of people, and this short little guy climbs up a tree, and Jesus ignores the crowd, walks to Zacchaeus and says, I'm going to come have dinner with you. He sits down and he has dinner in Zacchaeus' house. He doesn't stay out and say, I know he needs me, but look at all these other people that need me. I gotta play to the crowd here. They want to hear teaching. You think about this. When the woman with the flow of blood grasped at his garment and felt healing within her as she touched the hem of his garment, did he just go, well, good for her, and keep walking because he had a mission to do? No, he stopped. He knew she was going to experience a level of guilt and fear, that she was doing something that was wrong culturally and according to the law, to the Jewish law. And he took the time to stop, turn around, and show everyone she did the right thing. Go, daughter, your faith has made you well. The other thing Jesus did, not just being focused on people and going one at a time, but he actively chased people away. Have you read the parts of the Bible where Jesus is like, get out of here? He doesn't say that, right? But he says things like in Luke 14, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he can't follow me. I'm sorry, but that's a pretty steep barrier to entry, is it not? I gotta hate my kids and my wife and my parents and my siblings. Like a couple of those I could get on board with from time to time, but all at once, Like that's a pretty intense statement. That's gonna make a lot of people who aren't very invested go, oh, that guy's crazy. I don't want a part of that. Or what about in John chapter 6? John 6, he gets done, he does this twice in John chapter 6. First, in John 6, he does the miracle where there are people, they're sitting and they're hungry, and Jesus looks out and he's like, man, look at all these hungry people. Do we have any food? And so he takes 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he turns it into food for 5,000 people who were sitting there. He feeds 5,000 people. All right, so then he walks on water to get to the other side of the sea, and then the crowd ran around to meet him at the other side of the sea, and he sees them, and what does he tell them? If you're just here for the potluck, leave, right? You guys just want more food. And then they want another miracle, and he's like, if you're just here for the miracles, get out of here, right? And then he says this really weird thing at the end of John chapter 6. Have you heard? Where he said, please, if you will follow me, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And he uses those words in that order. And it's unsettling at best. It was so unsettling, we've talked about this before, that early first century Romans believed that Christians might actually be cannibals. It was like a rumor floating around because they eat the blood and flesh of this guy. That's weird. Listen, Jesus was not interested in amassing a following for his wealth or reputation's sake. Jesus was interested in people, knowing God, and being changed because of what they learned about him. We've got to do this today. We've got to, if we're going to subvert expectations, we've got to care about people. One of the best examples of this that I personally have ever seen, even though I've never been allowed to attend, is the youth camp that we do here. The youth camp is a week-long camp for girls that we do here. If you don't know what it is, you need to come check it out one of these days because it's fantastic. It's a week, and when you think of a week of servant camp, you probably think, well, you're volunteering, and yeah, there's some of that. And you probably think, well, you're learning the Bible, and yeah, there's a lot of that. Youth camp is one of the most unique weeks I've ever seen. Again, not been allowed to be a part of it because I'm not a girl, but I've been able to see part of it. There is an intentionality behind the week that is not about crafting, but about investing in the girls who are there. There is a focus on the people that are at the camp, the relationships that are built at the camp. There is, I don't want to call it a focus, but an overflow of that focus. There are tears when people are able to be vulnerable and share their lives with each other. There's growth when Christians come together. In this case, Christian girls come together in an environment where the focus is not the numbers. It could be a lot bigger camp. I don't know of a lot of camps like youth camp. We're not starting satellite camps to get our numbers up. The focus is not the numbers. Rather, the focus is the people and the quality of care given to these Christian girls, young Christian girls, so that they can learn who God is. If we're going to subvert expectations, we've got to care about people. You know the old saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. If we're going to subvert the expectations that Christians are all hypocrites, we've got to battle that by being honest, radically honest. If we're going to subvert the expectation that Christians are judgmental, we've got to subvert that by starting anywhere else and choosing to be compassionate because we need compassion just the same. And if we're going to subvert the expectation that churches are just all about money and notoriety, then we have to be all about people. Follow the example of Jesus. And truly, that's the point of the lesson today. That was a lot of words to say this. Look like Jesus. Subvert people's expectations like Jesus did. Look like Jesus so you can show the world who God is. There's an expectation of Christians that they're going to be a certain way. The challenge today is subvert those expectations, not for the sake of it, not because it's fun, not to make people uncomfortable, but subvert those expectations because it's a better representation of who Jesus is and what Jesus did. Amen. So the challenge today is simple, and the question today is simple. How much like Jesus do you look? Are people surprised when they get to know that you're a Christian? Man, you are not judgmental like other Christians that I've known. Are people surprised when they go, wow, you really care about people. You don't really care about the notoriety. Are people surprised when they interact with you that you are very honest about your faith? You don't try to pretend at all. That's who Jesus was, and that's who we need to be. If you don't look like Jesus, then today is the day to start looking more like him in your whole life, not just here on Sundays. And if you don't know Jesus, then of course the invitation is always open. If you need to know who he is so that you can be baptized into his death and be saved by his blood, then we can show you what the Bible says about that. If you have need of the church or any need of prayers, come, let us know what you need, and we will help you while we stand and sing.